Hello and welcome to a new episode of Material Matters with Grant Gibson. That's me. We're on Series 8, and as regular listeners will know, the idea behind the show is that I speak to a designer, maker, artist or architect about material or technique with which they're intrinsically linked and discover how it changed their lives and careers. The COVID virus is still very much with us, and that being the case, we thought it prudent to make this series over the internet. This week, I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Corbett onto the show. Sarah is an award-winning campaigner and author who began her career in activism at the ripe old age of 3, which is something we're definitely going to talk about, and went on to have a successful career as a professional campaigner for NGOs, including Christian Aid, Oxfam, and the UK Government Department for International Development. However, her career took a different turn in 2009 when she created the Craftivist Collective, which champions gentle protest and slow activism, often using stitching and embroidery as a fundamental part of its process. Since then, the organisation has grown in size and has thousands of members, while Sarah has delivered talks and lectures around the globe, launched a slew of successful campaigns, and worked with the likes of the V&A, Secret Cinema and Unicef. She's also done a TEDx talk that has been seen by more than 1 million people. Sarah, thank you so much for doing this. Are you there?
I am. I'm cringing while you're talking. Sorry, Grant.
That's all right. Cringing is fine. Well, look, we kick off generally on this podcast by finding out where people are and also how their 2020 has been. So first of all, can you just tell us where you are, Sarah? Do you have a studio as such?
I live and work in a studio apartment in an old library in East London. And that gives me an excuse to say to the listeners that if you hear any sirens, I'm completely fine, but I live on a main road with a single glazed large window, so you can hear everything.
So listeners, you have been warned. Tell us about 2020, Sarah. It's been a bizarre year, a tragic year. How's it been for you? Has it affected your ability to work?
Oh, hugely. I mean, I don't know anyone that it hasn't really. I was supposed to be in America for 5 weeks, 2 days before lockdown. And then I lost about 70% of my work because I do a lot of sensory events because of the line of work that I do. So it's been a challenge this year, I think work-wise, but also I think for everyone it's been a challenge mentally, physically, spiritually, in lots of ways. But, personally, I haven't had COVID and I have had quite a thick silver lining. I'm trying to remember that, I've had time to stop and travel less and have a proper think about where I can have most impact and what I'm doing. So there's been pros and cons, I think, for everyone. And I'm very aware of how lucky I've been compared to a lot of people.
And what were you going to be doing in the States?
So I was going to be working with a National Health Equity Foundation, supporting a lot of the charities that work on the ground in different states around health equity. And then whenever I go overseas, especially to America, I always do a lot of free work for different charities and teach a lot at different universities as a nice add-on, and to make sure that my carbon emissions of flying over there are, worth the effort.
Worthwhile.
So I was going to be teaching at Parsons again, which I love, and do some workshops and talks for the likes of UNICEF and Open Foundation and different places. Yeah, I'm right, always a workaholic, Grant, as you know.
Yes, a variety of things. I mean, look, I guess in the first instance, for listeners who might not know, it would be good to explain what craftivism is. I mean, I think I'm right in saying it's a term that was first coined by the artist, activist and writer from North Carolina, Betsy Greer, in 2003.
Yeah, you're good at your research. She actually coined it while she was living in Bethnal Green, living above Prick Your Finger, which was an amazing textile art little shop and gallery. And she was a knitter and still is a knitter. And she noticed in knitting circles that people would often slip into talking about politics or talking about make, do and mend and capitalism and what they can do, with their carbon footprint and all of that. So she very much saw these knitting circles as a form of activism and coined the word craftivism, which just means craft plus activism. And then I Googled craft and activism in 2008 when I was sitting on a train to Glasgow with my job at the time. It was a 5-hour journey from home. And I was exhausted as a as an activist in my professional life as a campaigner, but also joining lots of activist groups when I moved to London, and doubting the effectiveness of my own activism that I was doing personally, but also teaching professionally, and was completely exhausted and thought, I can't do my emails and reports on a train. It was a Pendolino train and I knew I'd get travel sick. So weirdly, I picked up a cross-stitch kit that cost me a £5 of this teddy that didn't really know what to do with, but I just missed using my hands, and I couldn't do watercolour painting on the train because that would be a mess. And I noticed there were certain elements that I thought, oh, this could really help my activism in terms of slowing down and thinking more critically. So I Googled craft activism, and this word existed.
So you hadn't come across Betsy Greer or any of that work before that point?
I'd never actually done much craft work. I was sort of always part of like the DIY punk scene, and when I was at university I was part of like the straight edge hardcore scene where I'd like make the cakes to fundraise at gigs and make merch for ex-boyfriends' bands, and but I never was part of craft at all. And then I contacted her because I saw the word existed, but she was very much a knitter, which I'm not, and I wasn't sure how it was activism, because as you've said, I'm from an activist background, so I'm always thinking, what are you trying to change? Who are the power holders? What are we asking to do? What's the change we want to see? And she said anyone can use the term craftivism in whatever you do, which was really gracious of her. And then I started tinkering around and people wanted to join in, and it all happened very organically and strangely.
Yeah. So I read your last book recently, How to Be a Craftivist, The Gentle Art of Protest. And it contains loads of fascinating words or phrases. I thought it might be interesting to unpick, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Activist robot. What is an activist robot, Sarah?
Well, it sort of links with collectivism and slacktivism. I think we've all been, I reckon everyone's felt like an activist robot sometimes. So it links in with, you get a petition in an email and you go, yeah, I'll just do that. And you don't really, you might believe in the charity that you've got it from and you do it quickly, but then you might forget about it. So more of that collectivism, but then also, I noticed that I was sometimes treating people like robots. My job in campaigns was often get as many petitions signed as possible and go to festivals and sign people up. I started seeing myself as just these people are just signatures. I just need to get as many people to sign this as possible. And if people were asking questions, I'd be thinking, I don't have time to answer this. I need to get the next signature. So I sometimes worried I was treating people as robots or just numbers on a petition or just bodies at a protest or at a demonstration. I'd have to recruit people when I was working for different charities to be outside Westminster at 7 a.m. on one campaign to get them to give out these fake newspapers around the Robin Hood tax campaign we were doing. And I just had to get bodies on the ground. So, yeah, a bit of collectivism, bit of just we need people to be there and it doesn't matter what type of people. And then that made me very uncomfortable. And I didn't think it was actually very strategic. Who are the decision makers and who do they listen to more than others? Rightly or wrongly, we're all influenced by different people. I thought we could be a bit more nuanced and not treat people like activist robots or treat ourselves as activist robots.
Well, funnily enough, slacktivist was also on the list, but I think you might have covered that off as well. Crafter thoughts.
Crafter thoughts are when it's like an afterthought, but it's a crafter thought. I love a good pun. So I have crafter thoughts questions in all of my kits and all of my projects. I have 3 for each, and they'll be bespoke to the issue or to the strategy for the project you're making. And I always have one that is while you're using your hands, so particularly for hand embroidery, once you're doing a repetitive hand action over some text you might have written and you don't actually need to think, your hands start having muscle memory and know what to do. Often your brain wanders off, and a lot of artists and craftspeople will talk about being in the flow where, you just sort of look up and 5 hours have disappeared and it's dark because you've been in the zone. So I get people to, instead of doing that lovely blissful thing, I'm like, you're not doing craft, you're doing craftivism. when your brain wanders off, that's when I get people to look at their craft of thought questions and use the repetitive hand action and the meditation and the comfort of craft to ask yourself quite uncomfortable questions.
So what kind of questions would you ask?
One is always, what are my values and how am I threading them through what I do? So it's juicy questions. So if you're making something for yourself to keep as a physical reminder to be a good global citizen, or a gift for a power holder, or something you're going to put out as street art, whatever you're doing, are you practicing what you preach? Can you do better yourself? We know that people change their hearts and minds and habits from mirroring other people, whether we like it or not. We're all role models. So it'll be that type of one. But then if you're making, like, we get people to embroider bespoke messages on handkerchiefs for power holders, like politicians or board members or others. And one question for that kit might be, if you were this head teacher, or if you were this politician, or if you were this CEO, what do you think some of the barriers are for you to implement these solutions? Is it capacity? Is it all of your shareholders want profit over helping the planet? What do you think some of the barriers are, and how can you empathise with being in that position that they're in? Because it's so easy for activists to say, hey, you decision maker, you should be doing this, this and this. And we don't think about all of the barriers they've got in terms of their work life, but also they might have issues in their personal life that we don't think of. We're just presuming the worst of them rather than the best of them.
Is empathising your craft of thought, really?
It's a bit of empathising, a bit of challenging yourself of whether you're acting what you're asking others to do. A lot of it's strategy as well. So if it's making something to put out as street art, like on mini banners, a question will be, where do you think the best place is to put this that's relevant to the topic, that provokes rather than preaches? So it's I have all the strategy for each project, and I now have the neuroscience for each of it as well for people to think through, and then have the craft of thoughts.
We're going to get into that a little bit later, but first I need to know what a shop drop is.
Shop drop is the opposite of shoplifting.
So what do you drop?
So I get people to drop mini fashion statements, which are beautiful little scrolls made out of watercolour paper, all the dimply, lovely quality paper, with an embossed pair of scissors and thread on, which is our Craftivist Collective logo. And I get people to write in a fountain pen or a gel pen on the outside, please open me, all lowercase, all cursive, like your neatest handwriting from primary school, with a little smiley face and a kiss. And then you wrap it up in purple, turquoise or mauve ribbon, and you shop drop them. So when people find them in items of clothes in shops that could be more ethical, whether they're trying them on or they've bought them, they're encouraged to open this little scroll because it says, please open me, rather than open me now. And then it has a poetic message inside about I have 3 ones that people pick which one they prefer. And it's about asking people to be curious about that item of clothing. Is it made with joy or pain? What's the story behind that item of clothing? And to find out more. And then at the bottom it says @FashRev for people to Google and find out hundreds of different ways they can be part of the ethical fashion initiative. So yeah, we shop drop little mini paper scrolls.
Final one, Sarah. Pretty protest. What might that be?
I do love alliteration, and when I was writing the book that you read, the editor was like, too much alliteration, love, too much. Pretty protest. So again, I always challenge people to think about, protest doesn't have to be big, loud, brash. That's needed at certain times, absolutely. But I often think the opposite of what the status quo is and just ask why. I don't do the opposite for the sake of it, but a pretty protest is a pretty protest. So my version of that is often picnics. So we've done campaigns where we're campaigning for train fares to not go up because that doesn't help commuters, but it also doesn't help carbon emissions. So we've done beautiful picnics inside train stations where we look like the railway children, and we have tea and cakes and blankets and offer people jam sandwiches to have a conversation about the campaign. We've done pretty protests outside different companies, always small, 12 people or less, so it's not in the way and it's not intimidating. And they're completely quiet, so we only talk if people ask us what we're doing, and we'll be stitching, we'll be having tea, we'll be having quiet chats with people who initiate conversations with us about what we're doing, and they will look like having bunting, and we all wear as much. I love wearing monochrome, but for our pretty protest we'll wear flowery patterns and not intimidating. outfit. So lots of hopeful yellows and pale colours, and a way of trying to be as non-aggressive and attractive as possible without losing your identity, but, you know, making it look as pretty and kitsch as possible without people feeling like they're not who they are.
The figure of 12 or less, is it coincidental that that's the number on a jury? I mean, where did the figure 12 come from?
So the figure 12 actually comes from, I can't remember which, I read a lot, and it was about how actually if you have more than 12 people tend to break off into smaller groups. 12 is probably the biggest you can have while people still feel safe to discuss and to share things without it feeling like it's too big a group. And if it's less people than 12, sometimes it can feel too intimate. So all my workshops tend to be 8 to 12 people around one table, or when I've done events for over 100 people, will be in cabaret style tables, so they're still sectioned off. But if it's less than 8 people, it can be a bit too intense for some people. So 12 is a really good number. And if you look throughout history, you know, you got the 12 disciples, you got the jurors, you know, it seems to be it's used a lot in different groups as a good number to try and have those intimate conversations.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, can I take you back to 2008, Sarah? Because you've alluded to the fact you bought a kit on a train for something to do. Mm-hmm. One of the things you've talked about in various places is this burnout that you were feeling at the time, and the fact that you needed to do something else. You've been a very successful activist. So I'm just wondering how this burnout manifested itself.
Yeah, I think I didn't realise I was so burnt out until I started this little kit. You know, that was one thing that I noticed straight away, was just separating the thread to cross-stitch this little teddy. I now know there's a faster way to do it, but I get people not to do that at my events. But just separating the thread into 2 groups of 3, if you do it fast, you'll knot it or you'll break it. So it forced me to slow down, and I immediately noticed how shaky my hands were, how shallow my breath was, how anxious I was, and just how exhausted I felt. I hadn't really checked in with myself, and lots of activist groups I was part of, we never made time to say, are we okay now? What baggage are we bringing to our activism? Are we doing okay? Are we burning out? And I think growing up as well, it was all about supporting the community and about campaigning, and, you know, it was all about giving and actually self-care. I think definitely in 2008 and before felt very hippie and privileged and, you know, a bit egocentric, which I've changed my mind on that now. Yeah, I immediately noticed I was actually quite burnt out. I wasn't as effective as a campaigner. I had a foggy brain. Looking back now, you know, I was absolutely burnt out. I was physically exhausted. I'm an introvert, which I didn't realise at the time. So I was always struggling to know, you know, why was I so exhausted when other people gained energy at protests or demonstrations?
Well, I'm interested in that because obviously you talk a lot about that in this wildly successful TED talk that you did, or TEDx talk, I should say. This notion of being an introvert, I mean, presumably you found something like doing that TED talk rather difficult in that case. Is that how being an introvert manifests itself?
No. So being an introvert is about where you gain energy. So, and it's a spectrum. So, you know, you can be an ambivert in the middle. So if you're an introvert, I'm quite an extreme introvert, which means that I love being on my own and I gain a lot. I have stimulus without needing people. My sister's quite an extreme extrovert, which means that she's desperate for stimulus, and it comes from other people. So she loves being around big groups. It gives her lots of energy. I'm always so overstimulated anyway with my own crazy thoughts and doing things that I like being with people, but I need a nap afterwards. And people are on the spectrum there. So the TED talk I did was called Activism Needs Introverts, talking about the strengths and weaknesses of everyone, and how there's lots of strengths to introversion that we can bring to activism without burning out. And it was a TED talk of the day, which is why it's on the TED website. So that's why it's a TED talk, but it's a TEDx talk. For me, I only knew, I watched a TED talk called by Susan Cain about her book called Quiet. And I had no idea I was an introvert, but it made lots of sense. And in terms of my activism, it was because I grew up in activism and I saw how great my sister was at chanting and mobilising people on big marches and loved it. And I wasn't good at that, but I was really good at taking minutes, being strategic, asking questions people hadn't thought of, find an unusual allies to say, well, would this person be someone that the power holder would listen to? Or if they say that they have, if a campaign was done unsuccessfully, I'd always question it and say, well, what if this quiet meeting happened? Or what if we gently did this? I think activism needs everyone from lots of different skill sets and different, introvert, extrovert, ambivert. But at the time, I was just doing what I thought activism was, and I was burning out from it because it wasn't my skill set and it was draining me of energy. And I still go on some marches, when I think that they're strategic and they've got a clear ask and they're not divisive. But sometimes I spend more time having private meetings or making gifts to build relationships with people as critical friends rather than aggressive enemies. And I think we need all of it.
Presumably you had activist friends. What did they make of this kind of change in 2008, 2009 in that case? Did they understand it straight away?
No, everyone was taking the piss out of me, especially because, craft was seen as quite anti-feminist as well. Are you sending people back to the kitchen and this is really cute? And then the other thing was people going, well, this is highly privileged because you need time to do it. You need money to buy the craft kits. I was probably my worst critic. I was thinking, oh my word, what am I doing? There's people where I grew up in Everton where, huge high unemployment, poverty issues, and I'm sitting in London cross-stitching. I felt really uncomfortable. My parents didn't really understand it. And I said, I don't know what it is yet, but I'm just tinkering. I think there's something in this, whether it's the process helping people think or whether it's, having those conversations or whether it's making stuff as street art. I wasn't sure at the time. But yeah, my activist friends and colleagues, and the campaign world is small, so there was whispers of, what is Sarah doing? This is very odd. But, the more I honed my craft and saw the strengths and weaknesses, the more I tried different projects that didn't work. You learn from mistakes. The more I actually thought, no, I think there's something in this. And I started a blog just because I was bored of talking to people about what I was doing. I just made a little blog for people to follow, forgetting that the whole world could see it. And suddenly, within a couple of months, I was getting emails from around the world from people saying, I'm a crafter who wants to use my craft for good, or I'm a burnt out activist too, or I'm not so sure about the demonizing and throwing eggs at politicians. Is that really helpful? There was people who were interested and wanted to join in. And I thought, well, if there's people who want to be part of the change they want to see in the world, but they feel excluded from activism, or they're housebound, or for different reasons don't get involved. It felt a little bit like I can't really not let people be involved. So that's why I set up the collective, and then it's grown. People saw something in it sometimes before I did, Grant.
Yeah. It's interesting because there is a relationship between craft and activism that's been going on for some time. I mean, whether you think about the UK suffrage movement at the turn of the century, 20th century, when the women embroidered 150 banners that marched with them. Obviously, the women at Greenham Common in the 80s would darn the fence with wool. I guess the biggest one, the one that people think about or talk about most, is the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which began in 1987 in San Francisco. Did you look into all those models when you started this?
So it was interesting because I didn't. Well, I was in my own little world thinking on that train, thinking, oh my word, one, this is helping me realise how burnt out I am and how I wanted to be more strategic in my campaigning. And it gave me the time to ask those uncomfortable questions that if I wasn't using my hands in a productive way and in this comforting way of using craft, I would have gone in a downward spiral and then changed my mind to think about something else. And then the people opposite me on the train were asking me what I was doing. And I thought, oh, isn't that fascinating? We're in Britain where we don't often talk to people we don't know. And I immediately thought, I didn't say it to them, but I immediately thought in my head, oh my word, if only I was cross-stitching a quote from Gandhi that we could talk about. But I wasn't, I was cross-stitching a teddy. So that gave me some ideas. Yeah, so I was thinking through them and then thought, okay, well, if I made something, where would it go? Or who would I give it to? And then it was only once people were coming to me and saying, oh, did you know about Gandhi with his wheel? And did you know this? And I looked into it. And actually, what I do is quite different. So I don't do anything big. There are craftivists out there who'll make beautiful handmade banners for marches and union marches. And I do gentle protest, which is what I call our unique approach to craftivism, because there's lots of approaches out there. So I always say it's a bit like punk. You know, you think of punk music and you've got all these different bands and musicians who sound completely different, but they're under that umbrella. And I think we need to see craftivism like that. You know, I'm a gentle protester and I teach gentle protest. Craftivism, which is all about small and being catalyst for conversation and change. So it's gifts for power holders. You know, some people do knitting around a big fence like the Commons, but our stuff is more about, gifts or small bits of text-based work or making yourself something as a physical reminder to keep at home or work. So although I definitely feel part of that lineage or that history, I don't do what those craftivists in the past have done.
So I'm intrigued with the punk reference. If you were a punk band, which punk band would you be, Sarah?
As an introvert, can I be a loner and go for, can I just be Patti Smith, please?
All right.
I've got this gorgeous black and white photo postcard of her in my bathroom on the mirror next to Martin Luther King and Gandhi and some others. She's just the coolest. I'd just quite like to be Patti Smith.
Can I ask, since you started all this, it seems to me people's attitudes to both activism and craft has changed. In the book, you talk about being, ghosted by a potential boyfriend when you told him what you did for a living. Do you think that would happen now?
Yeah, totally would happen. What's interesting is, the word activism is not as scary. Celebrities now are actually quite proud to put on their Twitter bio, I'm an actor, an activist, or this. Sometimes I worry whether they are an activist or whether they're a philanthropist, and they're very different things, and we need both. I do worry that people who aren't left-wing or centre-left actually feel quite excluded, whether it's right or wrong to feel that way. Sometimes I think they've misinterpreted it, but sometimes they are excluded. So I actually focus on working with groups who still feel excluded from activist groups, but might care deeply about particular issues. And we need people, of all across the landscape to be part of different campaigns. So there's still definitely baggage that's around the word activism and people who have a very clear view of what they think it is, and I have to challenge that a lot. But it is changing, and the fact that there's now, you Google craftivism and there's craftivists all over the world doing very different things with different views and different stories. I think it's changing, but I also worry sometimes with that as well, that it might dilute it. So a lot of people say, well, my activism is making beautiful vases, making, upcycling sleeping bags for the homeless. And I challenge them on that and say, okay, that's more emergency relief than activism. Like, activism is trying to challenge and change structures, systems, behaviours and cultures. We need development and we need emergency relief as well, but that's a different thing. I think we need to be clear on what is activism. I struggle with, I don't know whether your listeners are going to like this, I struggle a bit with art activism. I think art is about offering something that people take whatever they want from it. Activism, for me, I see more as design activism. With design, you have a goal, you have a theory of change, you have a plan of what's this function going to be for this object. And then you work backwards to make it, the most sustainable, the most beautiful, the most easy to use, but you have a clear brief. And I think with art activism, your art could be diluted because you're telling people what to do, or your activism could be diluted because you're too vague that people might misinterpret it, or you could actually disempower people because they don't know what to do with your big statement about something awful that's happened. I think we're in a world of lots of people want to be activists, but really I get people every day coming to me saying, I want to do stuff and I don't know how to do it, or they aim too high or too low or get their strategy wrong. And my passion isn't craft. My passion is how to help people be kind, effective activists. And I think we've got to see it as a craft.
You were brought up in Everton during the 80s in Liverpool. Your father was a vicar, I believe. I think your mum was a councillor or a politician.
Yep, they both still are.
They both still are. The 80s in Liverpool, that was a pretty traumatic time for the city, right? Thatcherism was in full flight. Liverpool was charting a very different course under Derek Hatton. Obviously, there was a horrific Hillsborough disaster in 1989. What was it like living through that period in that city?
Very informative, shaped me massively. It was tough. I struggle a lot when people say, oh, what you do is so privileged, and as a white woman, easy for you to say. And, I grew up in the vicarage in West Everton with high unemployment, housing that people were getting sick from because it was so damp. awful housing where we'd have heroin in the area and drugs and people hiding in our estates from the police because it was very good to hide in our patch. Huge inequality on the doorstep, and seeing people desperately wanting jobs and wanting to work, and it not being possible because of systems and structures, and seeing lots of depression and alcoholism and all the mix that you get in low income areas, and just thinking this can't be right. It just didn't feel fair that the area next to us had a shopping centre that you could buy fresh fruit and veg and you couldn't in our patch. And we didn't have a health centre. People would, drive through our area but never stop. So it was we never victimised ourselves, but there was definitely very aware that systems and structures could help change this, not just handouts. And you can pull yourself up with your bootstraps to a point. And, as the vicar's kid and the politician's kid, a lot of the campaigns happened in our back kitchen. So I was incredibly, grateful to be able to just listen to how campaigns were won and lost and where the strategies involved, and saw and heard a lot that often people don't realise is needed in campaigns because we don't see it on the front page of the papers or in people's PowerPoint presentations, because a lot of it's just building those relationships and figuring stuff out. So highly informative. And then as an 8-year-old, I went to South Africa on the only sabbatical my dad ever took. We went just after Mandela got out. And I was 8, so I saw, about peace and reconciliation work that Tutu was doing, and how sobering it was to think, if Desmond Tutu and Mandela can actually work with the people that had oppressed them and killed some of their friends, and they said, we've got to work with you so there isn't a civil war, completely sobers you up to think if they can do it, then we need to swallow our pride and try and serve the issue that's bigger than ourselves, and not just scream and shout at people, but try and work with people where possible and topple some people respectively where not possible.
Yeah. 5 years before you were in South Africa, at the age of 3, you were protesting about, well, you say you were protesting about something, you were being an activist. What were you being an activist at the age of 3?
Well, I say the age of 3, Grant, because there's photographic evidence from the Liverpool Echo.
I'm not denying it.
From the Liverpool Echo, the local newspaper, of me as a 3-year-old outside a row of social housing that was going to be knocked down to build a park that no one wanted, and would have made the area more unsafe and broke up families of generations who'd have to live outside the area, and our transport system in Liverpool at the time was awful. So we squatted, my mum and dad and members of the community of all faiths and none squatted in that row of housing to say, no, this doesn't make sense in terms of our community, doesn't make sense in terms of the plans for the city of safe places to live, and they're good housing. We needed the tower blocks knocked down and the maisonettes, but we didn't want this row of housing. So as a 3-year-old, we all did shifts with my parents and the community to save them, and we got a judge involved, we got both bishops to come squat with us, the Catholic and the Protestant, to get media attention. And we won the campaign through squatting, but also through the pro bono legal work, through getting it mentioned in the House of Commons in lots of different ways. So, my mum often says I was an activist in the womb, because we'd have lots of campaign meetings in our home and in other people's houses. It's funny because the photo of me, I just look quite confused, but I always did. I loved just listening and watching. So I'd often go along to things, and my mum would just leave me in the pram and say to people, just let her look. Don't put her in a place where she can't see anything. She just wants to watch and listen. So it helped, it educated me massively about how campaigns could be won, which is why I still campaign, because I believe activism can have huge long-term impact if it's done well. And what I get frustrated with is when media or people oversimplify it, and then people try and do a campaign and they lose, and then they give up and say activism doesn't work.
Well, you took that activism into secondary school. You did lose a campaign to get rid of gym knickers, I understand.
But I learned a lot from it, Grant.
What did you learn?
I learned that the PE teacher just wanted power and didn't like the fact that I was challenging it. So really, I should have tried to get the PE teacher on board and make her think that it was her idea and that it would make her look good. So that was a good learning for me. But I did win lockers for the school, so that balanced it out.
So there's obviously a lot of social justice conversation in your household. Was there any craft? Were you making things as a child?
So there wasn't craft. My mum, when we were really little, made some of our clothes. We were on a tight budget and she got given a sewing machine. But that takes a long time to do as well. I love to draw, so I draw and paint a lot, sit on my own and just draw on I vividly remember sitting on the floor in front of my mum's full-length mirror and just drawing whilst looking in the mirror. So I sort of was like drawing backwards and reverse and would give out letters that are like opposite of writing. So I looked like I was a little witch. People would look very scared at me because I was giving them these letters that I'd written through a mirror. So I really love that, but craft, not at all. And even in school, I didn't go to the best school, so our textile classes weren't brilliant, which is why it was quite odd actually thinking back of why did I pick up that cross-stitch kit. But I think one of the many great things about craft is if you have a blank canvas to draw or paint on, it can be really scary, even if you love art, which I do. Whereas if you have a cross-stitch kit, there's a pattern to follow and it's just crosses. So you can still use your hands and you're a little bit creative, but it doesn't have a blank canvas. So I just wanted to use my hands. I was sick of typing and writing and reading online. And I just felt this urge for this £5 kit to just make something with my hands, but without any pressure of it being beautiful or creating something new, and noticed that the process really helped, and then it created conversations, and then the handmade element was really startling for people. Even now, you know, people are really shocked when someone's given them a bespoke gift that's taken hours or leaves a beautiful cross stitch that's postcard size out somewhere relevant to an issue, and it's just left for people to see, you know, that element of it not being perfect and it being craft, and it has, you know, for some of us, the memory of our grandmothers or of cute craft in the past. Actually, I think the cuteness can help the message be seen and heard more than if it was big and loud and capital letters and just printed off a printer really cheaply.
Yeah, I mean, reading the book, Sarah, it seems to me you spread yourself quite thinly. How do you decide what you're going to protest about? You also describe yourself as quite an angry person in another podcast. So I'm intrigued, what makes you angry?
I'm very angry. Like, people say to me all the time, it's easy for you to be gentle. I'm like, no, it's not. I'm really angry about inequality, how it's getting worse. I'm really angry that people are part of fueling systems where our planet is dying. We're all part of the problems and the solutions, and, you know, there's only so much we can do. But I get very angry whether people are doing stuff because they're ignorant or whether they know what they're doing and they're just thinking of themselves. Or I know it's more complex than that, but yeah, I get very angry, which is why, and I don't want to just give in and go, oh, well, it's never going to change, because I've seen how things have changed in South Africa. I've seen things change in Everton and in lots of areas for the better. So I get very angry. I'm also a perfectionist and I really want high quality work to do. So I desperately try not to spread myself too thin. So at the moment I teach a lot. So I have the books, I have the kits. I've just done a free online course that comes out in January with Alison.com that anyone can use. I'm doing a new handbook to complete the trilogy of all of the projects that people can support the crowdfunding campaign for that. But then I also take on probably about 2 campaigns a year where I know that I can really help that organisation or that group.
There are these interesting micro moments that you describe. There's one on the street just outside Clapham Junction railway station where you'd seen some kids kind of behaving or boys in particular, conducting themselves in a manner you didn't really approve of, and you made like a Barbie doll or something. Do you find it hard to just walk by situations? You feel the need to somehow respond? If
I can, yeah, I do. So I was living in Battersea at the time, so I'd walk to Clapham Junction train station and go to the back end of the station for the entrance. And on the way back from work, I saw teenage boys, you know, with their arms across their girlfriends, the girls not talking, and the boys being very, you know, masculine and, you know, talking the talk. And they reminded me a lot of the lads I grew up with in my patch. And I just thought, well, you know, are they feeling like they've got to act in this particular way? And do the girls feel like they've got to not talk but look pretty? And I just thought, this power dynamic doesn't seem quite right. But who am I to know what they're thinking? So I thought, well, it might be quite fun if I got an old Barbie from a charity shop and I battered it up with bruises and I gaffer taped it nearby to where they were sitting when they weren't there, because I didn't want to get beaten up. And I put a little placard in her hand with a lovely quote by the first female Prime Minister of India, who said, and I'm probably going to get this quote wrong.
Indira Gandhi.
Yeah. Have you got the quote in front of you, Grant?
I don't actually, no. Sorry.
It says something about you can tell the quality of a country by the state of how the women are treated. And I'm always trying to straddle that balance of, I don't want to preach to people and tell them what to do, but I don't want to give them a fact that they go, what am I going to do this about? Or I don't want something so vague that they can misinterpret it. And I just thought, actually, this little battered Barbie with this quote in a placard from this incredible person that's about gender equality, but not naming and shaming the group. I thought it could be quite interesting. And I always have a photographer friend who takes a good photograph with me, because I thought even if they don't notice it, it could be an interesting image to share and for others to share and link in with different campaigns. And so I'm always trying to see how many ways that object can be used in different places. And that was done a few years ago. And it might be that now, people say, oh, not so sure about, there's different, baggage we bring to stuff now. I don't know whether I'd do that Barbie again now, but at the time it felt like something worth doing. Yeah,
well, I was going to say, let's talk about some of these campaigns, because I guess the one that's garnered the most attention is your protest to the board of M&S, trying to persuade them to install the living wage. Can we discuss how you went about doing that, Sarah?
How did I go about doing it? I did a little book called The Little Book of Craftivism a few years ago, and the CEO of Share Action, who's an incredible campaign organisation that does shareholder activism, she contacted me, and I'm a big fan. She didn't know this, but I was proper fangirl and had a big girl crush on her as a campaigner. And she emailed me saying for 3 years we tried to have a conversation with Marks and Spencer's about them becoming a living wage employer, and we've tried loads of types of activism and we're not getting anywhere, and I've just picked up your little book and it's so weird. I thought you might have an idea that might work or that might just be different to what we've tried. And she said, you've got 5 weeks before the AGM. What can you do? So my activist hat on, with my background, I was like, okay, so if the CEO isn't listening, who does the CEO listen to? The board. He's on the board. There's only 13 board members. He has to listen to them. He doesn't have to listen to me or others. So how do we engage them in it and do it in an attractive, gentle way if all of these demonstrations and things aren't working? And I think it was a year before, my MP at the time, I'd sent lots of petitions and postcards and emails to her saying, what are you doing on this campaign? And I can't believe you voted against this. And I got an email from her team asking me to stop contacting my MP. And they said it was a waste of my time and their time and charity's money. So I'd embroidered a message on a handkerchief for her to say, don't blow it, use your power for good. I know you've got a really difficult job and a big job, but I want to encourage you in your difficult role. And I put my name, Yours in Hope, and my postcode, so she knew I was a constituent. I asked to meet her, and it really changed the dynamic from her seeing me as this angry activist that was just shouting at her to seeing that I was quite nervous and embarrassed, but I'd spent hours making her this handkerchief that wasn't perfect, and I wanted to get to know her and see what made her tick. And we found some areas we'd agreed on and we had agreement with, and I'd helped her on some of those campaigns and vice versa. So instead of creating a new campaign for the sake of it, I said, well, why don't we buy handkerchiefs from Marks and Spencer's so we're seen as customers? I got 24 craftivists from across the UK who either looked like or were part of their core customer demographic, because I knew they'd listen to their customers more than other people, and I wanted them from across the UK, not just London centric. And I told everyone to Google everything about their board member. And we had 24 because we had 14 board members, 5 of the chief investment officers of the biggest companies that buy shares from M&S, because I knew that would scare them as well and they'd listen to them, and 5 of their celebrity models, which totally didn't make any difference at all. So that was good learning. But I said, Google everything about your hanky receiver, from what colours they wear, what makes them tick, what are their passions on LinkedIn, are they trustees somewhere, how did they rise up to be a board member, was it from the shop floor, was it from a different, right, try and see them as humans. What patterns do they wear, are they quite flamboyant, are they quite shy? We can all do Google searches and find a lot out about a lot of people, and then find a quote that is really inspiring about being the change in the world, but a quote from someone that they'd admire. So I got people to embroider a lovely timeless quote on a handkerchief that linked in just with about, being the positive change you want to see, not about the living wage. And for something that we thought that those gift receivers would like, it wasn't about what colours we liked or patterns we liked, it was about them. And then I got them to write handwritten letters saying, as a customer, I love M&S, I've grown up in your place and that's where we buy our knickers and our food and all of the stuff that we love about M&S, and therefore I'm quite sad that you don't pay the living wage, because not only does it make sense in terms of your employees being able to not have to get second jobs and stuff, but it also makes business sense for staff retention, for efficiency, for PR. We had a very robust argument to say, I'm saddened that you don't pay it because it doesn't make sense in terms of business and ethics, and I want to encourage you to have a conversation with Share Action, because I think you could actually pay the living wage, and wouldn't it be brilliant not only for M&S but also for other companies your size, bigger and smaller, who you're really influential for. And I think it would be brilliant, and I believe in you as a person to take this forward. And then we hand delivered them at the AGM in boxes with ribbon, and thinking about all of the stuff that your listeners love about the power of colours and fonts and design, and made sure everything was lowercase and hopeful colours and soft furnishings, lots of different elements. And then we hand delivered them, not with a big hoo-ha, but quite subtly and quite humbly, to each of them separately, and said, we've made you these gifts, read the letter in your own time. But as we bought a share each so we could go to the AGM, we said, as shareholders and as customers, I think this could be brilliant if you could do it, and we just want to see if it is actually possible for you to do. And of course, they all loved their handkerchiefs. We got meetings with the CEO and with the head of sustainability and HR. They came up with excuses over a few months, so we said, oh, well, that's interesting what you're saying. Can we go back and see whether, we can come up with another solution for you? And then I got people to do Christmas cards saying, all we want for Christmas is the living wage, and Valentine's cards saying, please show your love. So we kept momentum, and they announced a month before the next AGM that they were going to pay the living wage to 50,000 staff. So we went to the AGM and said, well done you, congratulated them. We didn't say, look, we've won this campaign. It wasn't about us and we would have lost good relationships with them. We said, well done you. It would be better if you could become a living wage employer, with the accreditation, which they still haven't done. But we wanted to say, we know you have a tough job and you've got lots to do. And what was interesting was they all came to us to say, thanks for my hanky. I went home and saw my two little boys who asked me what the living wage was, and I had to tell them. And another board member said, my hanky I've put in the archives of M&S in Leeds, because we put everything in the archive that has changed our company. So I put that in. And the chair of the board took me aside and said it was the most powerful campaign they'd experienced, because it was so respectful and it was unusual. And he was really honest with me. He said, it was so weird that every time we had a meeting, and they meet regularly, one of them would say, what was on your hanky? Because they didn't know, because we didn't do, what people often do in campaigns is, let's do a big presentation and we hang everything up and we say, look what we are giving you. And it wasn't about that. It was intimate activism. So they kept saying to each other, what was on yours? Where have you put yours? And then they'd say, their argument was actually quite interesting. Should we look into it? So although the living wage often wasn't on their agenda, it would pop up on their agenda because they had bespoke handkerchiefs that were bought from M&S, from their customers. We had a robust argument. All of the sensory elements of you remember something more if it's a surprise. We give good surprises, which creates dopamine in people, which means that they want to engage with you more because their body goes, that person gave me dopamine, I want to meet them again. Whereas most activist surprises are bad surprises, like milkshakes or shouting. So our bodies go, I don't want to engage with that activist because they made me feel bad, whether we want to or not. So there was lots and lots of elements, from the senses to the neuroscience to the language we use that was nonviolent communication. All of those elements is how the campaign was effective, I think.
I think you've alluded to this during our conversation, Sarah, but what role does beauty play in your protests, or your activism rather?
So much. And I was hoping you'd get onto that, because I was thinking we need to talk about the power of aesthetics. It's interesting. I'm on this 2-year fellowship and we had to do a bit of it's like a Myers-Briggs thing, but it's called the Hogan assessment. And my two motives I'm 100% on, which is quite rare to be so extreme, was altruism and aesthetics. And I think for me, I'm like, totally, that makes sense. Like everything I do is, how can we make the world better for everyone? And how can we use the aesthetics, the beauty in the world? I find it quite sad that a lot of activism is ugly when you think, hang on a minute, we're trying to promote a more beautiful, kind and fair world. And a lot of our activism isn't beautiful, kind or very fair on people. We demonize or we victimize, and we can be quite binary. And I just think I love exhibitions, I love films, I love aesthetics. I'm constantly like a magpie looking at pretty things. And I think activism can be like honey rather than vinegar, attract people with that honey of, doesn't this look intriguing and cute and a little bit interesting? And we know from neuroscience that if people self-initiate to want to see something, they go with more of an open heart and an open mind. So, coming back to shop dropping, our little scrolls are purple, turquoise or mauve because they're seen as luxury colours. And the paper is cream rather than clinical white, and lovely texture with the embossed stamp. So it feels quite luxurious and it feels quite exciting that you found it. And it's pretty to the eyes, even if it's not your style, you can still see the time and energy has been put into it, and the colours and the fonts are all thought out to try and make it attract people to be curious rather than to feel forced and shouted at and judged. And I think beauty is just, we need to harness it much more.
As you've already pointed out, words are important too in finding the correct message. You mentioned in the book about the Catherine Hamnett t-shirts with the big emblazoned choose life messages on them that have been subverted. I wonder if there's a danger this could happen to what you do. You've crafted this handbook now, and that could be used by people you don't approve of, I guess. Craft is generally seen as this quiet, humble sort of activity, but it has been used as a propaganda tool by fascist governments in Germany and Italy. They organised a big craft fair in Berlin in 1938. I mean, does that kind of thing worry you?
It did much more than now, but it does a bit, yeah. I think because there's more demand for what I do, and I can't just do lots of delivery, so I'm always thinking, how can I give people the tools to do it and do the handbook and do all of the different bits? I'm worried people can... our mini banners, for example, we've had people who've written really hateful, divisive stuff and hung them up, and I don't have much control over that, and it's quite sad. But a lot of the time it doesn't happen, and I get emails and direct messages from people saying, I started stitching quite a hateful thing, and then I read your Craft of Thoughts and thought, oh no, that's not very loving. And that's not... So it actually, if you do the process well, it sort of filters out people who are doing it for a hateful reason. I've had lots of people who started very angry and very demonizing of someone, and then they've gone through the process of the strategy of the stitching or the making themselves, and then how they're going to put it out there, and that's helped them sort of mitigate that risk of being hateful. Craftivism in general, if you look at it, I talk a lot about how gentle protest is what I do with the Craftivist Collective, and there are other forms out there, because sadly there are quite harmful forms of craftivism out there. I've seen, and they're much more popular than my stuff. So I've seen crocheted voodoo dolls of Donald Trump, which people will find hilarious and share lots and like much more on Instagram. And I find that harmful rather than helpful, because you're focusing on personality, not policy. You're demonizing people, you're scapegoating. You're not actually doing anything apart from objectifying someone and saying, yeah, that's awful and they're awful. You're not thinking, why are they doing it? How can I be part of the change locally, nationally, internationally?
I was interested you weren't that keen on the pussy hats, which was, for listeners who don't know, an open source knitting pattern that sprung up in advance of the Women's March on Washington in protest at Donald Trump. What was it about that you didn't like, Sarah?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's easy for all of us, isn't it, to find everything problematic and pull it apart. So, there's great stuff of it was visual, it helped the media, it did definitely make people feel not alone around America. I have lots of craftivists in America and I do a bit of work there, and you saw the hope of like, oh my word, other people feel like this as well. My concern was, like a lot of activism, it's quite simple and it can have risks of polarization. So, the fact that they were all pink excluded a lot of people who are not white. There's people who might not be able to wear them because their partner is against them politically in that area, or their area, they feel like they can't wear them. There's a real risk with a lot of activism. I work mostly with people who don't see themselves as activists or who don't like activists. And they will always be like, they're so smug, they're judgmental, it's easy for them to do, they make me feel bad. There was a risk of that, of if you're not with us, you're against us, not knowing the complexities of people, and it being very simple of, this is all awful, Trump is awful, when we need to look at, okay, what are the systems, what are the structures, what are the biases, it was a great thing for knitters to do and feel really good about themselves and say, I've done something really good with medium that I love to use anyway. So it got lots of people saying, this is great, really empowering. And for some of them, it led to campaigning on the ground in their community on abortion, on lots of different issues. But for some people, it was, I've done this nice thing and that's it. So I think we got to be honest with people of the importance of nuance, the importance of strategy, the importance of your craftivism object is a catalyst, not a conclusion. How do you mitigate those risks of people feeling excluded, of demonizing, of oversimplifying things, of people just doing 100 knitted pink hats and saying, does anyone want them? I'm going to make more. And you think, is your motive that you love knitting, or is your motive that you want to serve this cause for equality? So I do a lot of challenging, hopefully in a loving way, of people to say, you know, what are your motives? What's your strategy? And nothing's perfect. And in lots of ways, you know, it gets the conversation happening. The fact that the V&A have got one in their archive and other galleries have means the conversation around feminism and around gender equality and around people abusing their power as presidents is being had. But I think we've got to be careful that it's not fueling division or oversimplifying things or making people just feel great.
I think it might be a bit late in America, Sarah. I think the division has been fueled. But look, I have taken up loads of your time. Our hour is kind of up. So it's the final question, which is the inevitable. What are your plans for the future?
My plans for the future are, how can I make the Craftivist Collective as welcoming and accessible for everyone to use our kits and tools and free resources? And I'm doing stuff on climate next year because we've got COP in Glasgow, which is a big important thing, and helping with a few projects. But yeah, for the future, I want to help people be effective, gentle craftivists. I want to help people be good, gentle protesters, not using craft as well. And, you know, just be of best use without burning out. It's a bit of a hippie answer, but, you know, make activism more beautiful, kind, and just.
There was me thinking the punks hated hippies. I mean, what's going on? Anyway, yes, no, that was lovely, Sarah. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciated it. It was genuinely enlightening.
Oh, thanks for having me, and I hope it was helpful for your listeners.
No, it's a complete pleasure. Thank you.
All right, man. Take care.
To discover more about Sarah and the Craftivist Collective, go to craftivist-collective.com. She's also crowdfunding a new book, which you can find out more about at unbound.com. There are images from the interviews, as well as little films and other things on my Instagram page, Grant on Design. And I have a new website. You can find all the podcasts that I've done, sign up to my newsletter, and lots of other stuff at grantondesign.com. If you've enjoyed listening and want to see this podcast flourish, then please rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this from. And if you feel so inclined, you can go to my Patreon page and make a pledge at patreon.com/material matters. You'll be helping to take the message of the importance of materials, skill, craft and design to a whole new audience. Thanks so much for listening, and please stay safe and well.